Welcome to another deep dive. Today we're heading north, way north, to the Arctic.
A place that honestly didn't used to be on too many radars, right?
Right. It was the frozen frontier, remote, desolate, but not anymore, huh?
Definitely not. Now it's a hotbed of activity and international interest.
Yeah, and our listeners know a good story when they see one. They sent us a ton of research about the growing geopolitical tensions up there. So, what changed? Why is everyone suddenly vying for a piece of the Arctic?
Well, in the simplest terms, the ice is melting, and that opens up a lot of possibilities, like new shipping routes.
And access to a wealth of natural resources, right? I mean, wasn't there something about a huge amount of the world's undiscovered oil and gas reserves being up there?
It's significant.
Yeah.
We're talking potentially a quarter of the world's undiscovered oil and gas.
Wow. So it's like a modern day gold rush.
In a way, yes. And some countries, like Russia, are taking a very proactive approach.
Yeah, their investment in icebreakers really stood out in the research. They're projected to have almost 14 icebreakers by 2030, which seems like a crazy number. Is that right?
It is a substantial number, yes. And it's about more than just breaking ice. Icebreakers are crucial for year-round presence and operations.
So it's about control and access.
Exactly. Access to those resources we were talking about, conducting research, and even military exercises. It's about projecting power.
So these icebreakers are pretty important.
They're critical. Think of them as the ultimate Arctic tool. They can clear shipping lanes, support scientific research, act as platforms for search and rescue. Even some are equipped for combat.
Wow. Okay, so it's not just about having them, it's about what you can do with them.
Precisely. And other countries are paying attention, like the United States with their Ice Pact.
Right, with Canada and Finland. So what's the strategy there? Why team up?
Well, Canada and Finland are powerhouses when it comes to Arctic shipbuilding and navigation. They have the experience, the technology, the know-how to operate in those extreme conditions.
So the U.S. is playing catch-up.
In a sense, yes. This partnership gives them access to that expertise, allowing them to close the gap with Russia and maintain a presence in the region.
A united front.
You could say that. It's about presenting a united front, yes, but also about pooling resources and knowledge to navigate this increasingly complex geopolitical landscape.
And then you have China entering the scene.
Right, China. They're not just observing from the sidelines anymore, are they?
No, they're building their own icebreaker fleet, investing in research, forming partnerships. It seems like they have a plan.
They do. And a big part of that plan involves the Northern Sea Route. Have you heard of that?
Vaguely. It's a shipping route, right?
It is. It runs along the Russian Arctic coast,
Yeah.
connecting the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. As the ice melts, it becomes more and more navigable, offering a faster, more cost-effective alternative to traditional shipping routes.
And that's a big deal for China with their focus on trade and global commerce.
Absolutely. It could shave weeks off shipping times between Asia and Europe, significantly impacting their bottom line.
So China's playing the long game, using the changing Arctic landscape to their advantage.
Exactly. They're thinking strategically, investing in the future. Some even believe they see the Arctic as an extension of their Belt and Road Initiative, a polar Silk Road.
Wow, a polar Silk Road. That's interesting. So we've got Russia flexing their icebreaker muscle, the U.S. trying to catch up, and China strategically positioning themselves for the future.
It's a fascinating and complex situation, and we haven't even touched on the environmental implications yet.
And you're right, we haven't even touched on the environmental side of this. I mean, with all this talk of icebreakers and shipping routes and resource extraction, it feels like we're kind of, I don't know, ignoring the elephant in the room.
It's a valid concern. The Arctic is incredibly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. We're already seeing the effects, the melting ice, rising sea levels, unpredictable weather patterns. It's impacting everything, from polar bears to migrating birds.
And all this increased activity is just going to make things worse, right?
It has the potential to, yes. We're talking about increased risk of oil spills, habitat disruption, pollution from shipping traffic. It's a lot to manage in an already fragile environment.
It's kind of ironic, isn't it? Like, the race for these resources, especially fossil fuels, is going to end up hurting the very environment it depends on.
It's a complex issue for sure. We have this incredible potential for economic growth and resource development, but it has to be balanced with the urgent need to protect the Arctic ecosystem.
Finding that balance seems difficult, to say the least. So, where do we even begin? What's being done to address these environmental concerns?
Well, there are organizations like the Arctic Council.
Right, the Arctic Council. I remember reading about that. What is it exactly? Like, who's a part of it and what do they do?
So the Arctic Council is an intergovernmental forum made up of the 8 Arctic states, Canada, Denmark, Finland, Iceland, Norway, Russia, Sweden, and the US.
Okay, so all the major players are at the table.
Yes, and importantly, they also include representatives from 6 indigenous permanent participant organizations, giving a voice to those most directly impacted by the changes happening in the region.
That's good. So it's not just nations, but also the people who actually live there?
Exactly. And they collaborate on a lot of things: sustainable development, environmental protection, scientific research.
So they're actually coming up with solutions.
They are. They develop agreements on things like oil spill preparedness and response, search and rescue cooperation, and they conduct assessments of the Arctic environment to understand what's happening and what needs to be done.
That's really positive. But are these agreements, are they actually, binding? Are countries really following through?
That's the big question, isn't it? The challenge is that the Arctic Council's decisions are non-binding. They rely on the member states to voluntarily implement their recommendations.
Which, knowing how these things tend to go.
It can be a challenge, especially when you're talking about something like the Arctic, where there are so many competing interests, economic interests, national security concerns.
Right, because if one country decides to prioritize their own interests, it kind of undermines the whole point of cooperation.
That's the risk, and we have seen tensions arise, particularly with Russia's increased military activity in the region.
So it's a bit of a double-edged sword. You have this platform for dialogue and cooperation, which is fantastic, but then you have these underlying tensions and the potential for things to escalate.
It's a balancing act, for sure. And finding that balance, finding a way to move forward that benefits everyone, that protects the Arctic environment, it's going to require a real shift in thinking.
It feels like we need to stop thinking about it as a zero-sum game, like one country wins and the others lose.
Exactly. What happens in the Arctic affects everyone. It's about recognizing that we're all interconnected and that working together is not just the ideal scenario, it's the only viable path forward.
Which means open communication is more important than ever.
Absolutely. We need transparency, we need dialogue, and we need a commitment to long-term solutions, even if they require short-term sacrifices. And that's not just on governments and organizations, it's on all of us.
It really highlights how crucial international cooperation is going to be moving forward. And speaking of moving forward, one thing I keep thinking about is the role of technology in all of this. We've talked about icebreakers, but what about other technologies? Could they be used to, I don't know, mitigate some of the negative impacts we've been talking about?
Absolutely. Technology has a huge role to play, both in monitoring the environmental changes and in developing more sustainable solutions.
Like what? Give me some examples.
Well, we're already using things like remote sensing and satellite technology to track ice melt and monitor changes in wildlife populations.
That makes sense. But what about solutions? How can technology help us actually address some of these challenges?
That's where it gets really interesting. Think about renewable energy, for example. Things like offshore wind farms or tidal power systems could provide cleaner energy to Arctic communities and research stations, reducing reliance on fossil fuels.
Right, so instead of just taking resources out of the Arctic, we could be using technology to make our presence there more sustainable.
Exactly. Or imagine using AI and remote sensing to help manage resource extraction more responsibly. We could potentially identify areas where mineral extraction, for instance, would have the least environmental impact.
It's fascinating to think about, technology is often seen as part of the problem, but it can also be part of the solution.
Absolutely. It's about using it wisely, with a focus on long-term sustainability rather than short-term gain.
Which brings us back to the importance of collaboration and forward-thinking policies. This whole conversation has been incredibly eye-opening. The Arctic is changing, and the stakes are high, but it feels like there's also this sense of potential, wouldn't you say?
I agree. It's a pivotal moment, a chance to really rethink our relationship with this region and with each other, frankly. It requires a global effort, but I'm cautiously optimistic.
Me too. And I think that's a good note to end on. So for our listeners out there, thank you for joining us on this journey to the top of the world. It's a story that's still being written, and we encourage you to stay informed, stay engaged, and stay curious. Because what happens in the Arctic affects us all.
Very well said. Thanks for having me.